Today, we're stepping into a time machine destination, the gritty, glamorous, and unforgettable streets of New York in the 1970s. This isn't just a look back, it's a full-on immersion into a city that was wild, raw, and bursting with character. We'll walk through the most iconic avenues, from Times Square and all its neon sleaze, to the birth of hip-hop in the Bronx, the protests of Union Square, and the punk rebellion in the East Village. Some places thrived, others decayed, but all of them pulsed with a kind of energy that today's city can only dream of. By the end of this journey, you'll ask yourself, has New York lost its soul or just evolved? One thing's for sure, you're about to see the city like never before. In the 1970s, Fifth Avenue was still the crown jewel of Manhattan, but it was a crown starting to lose a bit of its luster. The street that once symbolized elegance and luxury began to feel the effects of New York's broader economic decline. Iconic department stores like B, Altman and Bonwit Teller faced dwindling profits, while high-end retailers struggled to keep up with rising crime rates and shifting consumer trends. Tourism slowed down, and locals grew wary of venturing out after dark. The glamour was still there, but it came with a nervous edge. Still, Fifth Avenue managed to hold on to much of its prestige thanks to its iconic architecture and landmarks. The New York Public Library, Rockefeller Center, and St. Patrick's Cathedral continued to draw visitors, while the stretch along Central Park remained one of the city's most scenic corridors. But beneath the polished storefronts, there was a quiet unease, a tension between tradition and change, between the old money image and a city on the brink of financial collapse. The Bowery in the 1970s was a world apart from the gentrified avenue it is today. Back then, it was a chaotic stretch filled with fluff houses, liquor stores, and pawn shops, where the homeless mingled with junkies and aging war veterans. But it wasn't just a place of despair, it was a cultural pressure cooker. CBGB opened its doors in 1973, becoming the launchpad for punk rock legends like the Ramones, Blondie, and Talking Heads. What looked like ruin was actually revolution in the making. This street was a raw nerve of the city, alive with rebellion and counterculture. Artists and musicians flocked here not for comfort but for freedom, creative and personal. Rent was cheap, expectations were low, and anything felt possible. The Bowery was where you went when you had nothing to lose and everything to express. It may have been rough around the edges, but it was also real, and that authenticity made it legendary. 125th Street in the 1970s was both a stage and a battleground. It was the cultural heartbeat of Harlem, home to the iconic Apollo Theater where future legends performed for tough, discerning crowds. But outside its glowing marquee, the neighborhood was struggling. Jobs were scarce, buildings were neglected, and poverty cast a long shadow over daily life. Yet even amid hardship, 125th Street refused to lose its soul. This stretch was lined with Black-owned businesses, beauty salons, barber shops, soul food joints, and street vendors selling everything from incense to vinyl records. Activist groups and artists gathered here, using culture as both shield and sword against systemic inequality. The street buzzed with energy, resilience, and pride, a reminder that Harlem was more than its struggle sit, was a symbol of survival and identity in a city undergoing radical change. In the 1970s, Delancy Street was a living mosaic of cultures, where Jewish, Puerto Rican, Chinese, and Dominican communities coexisted in a chaotic but deeply authentic New York ecosystem. The tenements were worn, the sidewalks cracked, and the storefronts modest, but life pulsed through every block. You could hear salsa music spilling out of bodegas, smell niches and dumplings in the air, and see grandmothers on stoops sharing stories in half a dozen languages. This was the immigrant dream in gritty, unfiltered form. But Delancey wasn't without its struggles. Crime, poverty, and crumbling infrastructure were daily realities, and urban decay cast a long shadow over the neighborhood. Still, there was something uniquely beautiful about the resilience of its residents. They built tight-knit communities, celebrated old-world traditions, and shaped the evolving cultural fabric of the city. In the face of adversity, Delancey Street offered a kind of strength, born not of wealth, but of survival. Sedgwick Avenue may have looked unremarkable in the 70s, another worn-down stretch in a borough plagued by neglect, but it quietly gave birth to a global revolution. At 1520, Sedgwick, a young Jamaican immigrant named Clive Campbell, better known as DJ Kool Herc, threw a back-to-school party in 1973 that would go down in history. Spinning breaks from funk and soul records, Herc created the blueprint for hip-hop. What began as a local block party became the heartbeat of a worldwide cultural force. The Bronx at that time was ravaged by arson, unemployment, and city indifference. Yet it was in this crucible of hardship that one of the most influential art forms of the 20th century was born. Sedgwick became a symbol not just of hip-hop's roots, but of how culture can emerge from chaos, creativity from crisis. From broken streets and shattered buildings came beats, rhymes, and a movement that would redefine music, fashion, and identity across the globe. Wall Street in the 1970s wasn't the sleek, glass and steel power corridor we picture today. It was a neighborhood of uncertainty, navigating the aftermath of Vietnam, the oil crisis, and a crumbling faith in American capitalism. The economy was on shaky ground, and financial institutions, though still powerful, were grappling with inflation, job losses, and changing global dynamics. The suits still walked fast, but the swagger was gone. Amid the economic gloom, there was also quiet reinvention brewing behind closed doors. The decade laid the groundwork for the Wall Street boom of the 1980s, with deregulation talks, technological advances, and a growing culture of risk-taking. But in the 1970s, the canyon of buildings felt heavier, more austere, as if the city's financial soul was waiting to be reborn. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't thriving, but it was evolving. In the 1970s, Times Square was a place of contradictions. The neon lights dazzled, the crowds never stopped flowing, and the streets pulsed with energy day and night. But beneath the glowing signs and flashing marquees, a darker, seedier reality defined the area. Peep shows, adult theaters, and street hustlers made Times Square a symbol of urban decay as much as urban excitement. Tourists came for the spectacle. Locals often avoided it, and New York's soul seemed trapped between glamour and grit. It was chaotic, raw, and undeniably alive. Taxi horns, street performers, strip club barkers, and police sirens created a symphony unique to the era. Times Square wasn't safe, but it was unforgettable, and for many, it represented the city at its most unfiltered. It was a place where you could lose yourself, sometimes in awe, sometimes in danger. And while the cleanup of the 90s transformed the area, many still long for the unpolished freedom of its wilder years. By the 1970s, Christopher Street had become a sacred ground in the fight for LGBTQ+ rights. In the wake of the 1969 Stonewall riots, the street was more than a neighborhood. It was a beacon of resistance, identity, and pride. Lined with gay bars, bookstores, and community centers, it became the heart of a growing movement. Activists rallied, lovers strolled hand in hand, and people who had long lived in fear began to claim their space in public life. But Christopher Street wasn't just political, it was joyous, romantic, and defiantly alive. The Village, vibe artistic, progressive, and full of expression, flourished here. Drag queens, poets, musicians, and outcasts all mingled in its cafes and sidewalks, creating a cultural patchwork that defied convention. In a city that could often feel hostile, Christopher Street offered a rare safe haven where love and identity weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. West Broadway wasn't lined with boutiques or luxury galleries. It was raw, industrial, and brimming with creativity. Soho's cast-iron buildings, once abandoned factories, were quietly transforming into spacious artist lofts. Painters, sculptors, dancers, and musicians took over the neighborhood, drawn by cheap rent and huge windows that let the light flood in. It became the epicenter of New York's underground art world, and West Broadway was its main artery. There was no pretense, no red carpets. Instead, exhibits spilled out into the streets. Performance art happened in empty warehouses, and the community thrived on experimentation and rebellion. It wasn't just artiste, it was anti-commercial, anti-mainstream, and beautifully chaotic. As Soho became more desirable, developers began sniffing around. But in the 70s, it still belonged to the dreamers, the radicals, and the creators who defined a generation of New York cool. Even during the turbulent 1970s, Broadway held on to its magic. The theater district remained a glittering jewel in a city that was otherwise crumbling in places. Legendary shows lit up the marquees, and the streets were filled with the buzz of pre-show excitement and the echo of standing ovations. For many, Broadway was an escape world of music, drama, and glamour that offered refuge from the harsh realities outside the theater doors. But the surrounding Midtown blocks told a different story. Crime was rising, and Times Square's descent into vice cast a shadow over the theater district. Patrons were wary of what lurked in the alleys beyond the velvet ropes. Still, actors performed, curtains rose, and the heart of American theater kept beating. Broadway was both defiant and enduring, a symbol that even in New York's darkest decade, art would not be silenced. In the 1970s, Canal Street pulsed with life noisy, crowded and packed with vendors selling everything from knockoff watches to herbal remedies. This was the economic engine of Chinatown, where locals bartered, tourists browsed, and generations of immigrants carved out a living. Its grit was part of the charm. The signs were in Chinese, the smells of dumplings and dried fish filled the air, and the sidewalks were a continuous stream of energy. While the rest of the city struggled with economic collapse, Chinatown's resilience stood out. The community stuck together, supported their own, and kept businesses alive. The streets were chaotic, sure, but they were also deeply communal. Canal Street may not have had polish, but it had soul. It was a testament to survival, identity, and the hustle that defines so much of New York's immigrant story. Park Avenue in the 1970s remained a symbol of wealth and influence, towering high above the chaos playing out in other neighborhoods. Corporate headquarters lined the street, luxury co-ops gleamed with old money, and doormen stood guard over lives far removed from subway strikes and burning Bronx buildings. It was a street of polished shoes, tailored suits, and whispered boardroom deals. But even Park Avenue wasn't immune to the city's broader downturn. Real estate took hits, and economic anxiety crept even into elite spaces. While the city faced bankruptcy and crumbling infrastructure, Park Avenue residents looked on from penthouses with growing unease. Still, the avenue maintained its aura of prestige. In a time of turmoil, it represented both stability and stark inequality, a corridor of power surrounded by a city struggling to hold itself together. In the 1970s, East 14th Street and Union Square were alive with political fire and grassroots movements. Long before the park was cleaned up and surrounded by chain stores, it was a meeting ground for dissent. Anti-war protests, labor rallies, civil rights demonstrations. Union Square was the city's megaphone, where passionate voices echoed through the streets. It wasn't polished, but it was real, loud, and fiercely democratic. Around the square, the mood was one of urgency and resistance. Artists mingled with activists, students handed out flyers, and street preachers competed with protest chants. The surrounding storefronts were rough, the subways dangerous, but Union Square remained a place of convergence, where anyone with a cause could speak up. In a city on the edge, 14th Street was its open nerve. Few streets in the 1970s embodied New York's underground spirit like St. Mark's Place. Tucked into the heart of the East Village, this was the center of punk, poetry, rebellion, and DIY culture. Leather jackets, safety pins, dive bars, and graffiti-covered walls were part of its visual language. It was raw, defiant, and refused to be tamed. If you wanted to hear the next big band before they blew ooper, get screamed at by a street poet, this was the place. But St. Mark's wasn't just chaos. It was a laboratory of culture. CBGB wasn't far, and neither was the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church. Young punks, drag queens, political radicals, and struggling artists all collided here. It was loud, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous, but utterly magnetic. The East Village didn't try to impress it, challenged, provoked, and inspired. In the 1970s, West 57th Street stood apart from the grit, creeping into other parts of Manhattan. This was a boulevard of refinement, home to Carnegie Hall, fine art galleries, and a growing stretch of luxury residences. Artists and musicians brushed shoulders with the city's elite, and while it wasn't immune to the wider city's decay, it held on to its sense of class and culture. Yet under that polish, you could feel the city's tension. Artists fought for space as real estate prices started to inch upward again. The street was at the crossroads of change, still sophisticated, but slowly becoming more commercial. West 57th was an island of elegance in a turbulent city, and for many, a place where beauty and struggle met on the same block. After this journey through 15 of the city's most iconic streets in the 1970s, it's impossible not to ask, how much has really changed? Some have been completely transformed, others have lost a piece of their soul, and a few still echo what they once were. But each of them tells a story that deserves to be remembered. Every corner we visited was, in its time, a direct witness to the city's pulse, its struggles, its art, its decay, and its brilliance. In a city that never stops reinventing itself, it's vital to look back and value what once was. Because if we don't preserve the memory of these places, we risk losing what truly makes this city unique. Tell us in the comments, which of these places surprised you the most? Do you prefer them now or in their 70s version? And if you enjoyed this trip back in time, hit that like button. It's free, but it helps us a lot to keep growing and creating more content like this. See you in the next one.